So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to just make a few opening remarks about the panel and about the Global Centers. This is the 10th anniversary of the Global Centers. There are 9 of them. We're very proud of what has been accomplished. They have become part of Columbia and utilized by faculty and students and others in ways that really advance the mission of the university. It combines this idea of global centers with climate change and the actions of the university in teaching and scholarship to utilize the global centers. So the combination of these two things, very, very important and valuable to the university. I've said this on many occasions, so I'll say it very briefly here, but it's important to say. The Global Centers are an effort to try to advance the scholarship and teaching of the university. Many universities have tried to grapple with the fact that the interconnected, globalized world requires more effort by universities to be out in the world. And one strategy has been to set up branch campuses, and a number of institutions have done that famously. We decided early on that that was not going to be our approach, and that we would have instead a small presence in various parts of the world that would form a network and that would help our faculty and our students understand more about the world. And so this is an exercise in trying to advance our capacity to do what we do here in Morningside Heights and Washington Heights and Lamont Doherty and so on. We think we need to learn more about the world. These global centers are there to help us do that. Climate change is something that I think we're all sort of going through a really, really important mental process of grasping just the magnitude of what it is that we are facing. And it's become my view that universities need to do more to rise to the challenge of what it is that climate change will bring. And to that end, early on in the semester, set up a task force to focus on whether we should do more, and in particular, whether it would be advisable at this point in history to establish a school on climate change. The report has just been submitted to me by the task force, and we will be dealing with this over the next few weeks, and there will be public announcements about this to come. But we start from a base on which we can be, about which we can be very proud. That is a base of work on climate change throughout the university. And leading the Earth Institute now and leading the task force on climate and what the university should do is Alex Halliday. Now, Alex came to Columbia from Oxford a short time ago and has already had a very, very profound effect on the institution. He is a great scientist. He has deep passions about what universities can and should do in this area, and it's a real pleasure to have him open this session today. So I invite up Alex Halliday. Alex?
So just going to say a couple of words, and then I'm going to invite the panelists up. So I've been here just about 18 months, and it's been an amazing period of time for getting to know this wonderful university and everything that's going on here. The reason why I was attracted to Columbia, I've known about the Earth Institute for many years, is because I think Columbia has greater strength, both in terms of the underlying disciplines of climate in particular and sustainability. But also in terms of the way it engages across disciplines. And it's been, the Earth Institute's well known globally for what it's been able to achieve in that area. And the climate problem, the climate crisis as it's now being called, is one that requires thinking across vastly different disciplines. So it's not just about the science, and it's not just about the engineering solutions. It's about understanding human behavior. It's about understanding how public health will be impacted. But it's also actually about even people expressing their views and their concerns and issues about how the arts and the media might want to engage with the human side of the crisis that we're facing. And this is something that Columbia can really excel in relative to other universities globally because of our strength across the piece. And so that's what we're thinking of, that's what we've been looking at in particular with this task force that Lee commissioned and asked me to chair. And we've had an amazing time. It's been fantastic to engage with so many different academics across the university. So many have been very excited about the ideas. And today what we're going to do is just going to bring some of these leading academics together in front of you to, in particular, reflect on how we engage broadly with the world on the issues of climate change. There is a sense in which academics, like myself, we are intensely competitive. We've risen to the top in our fields not by cooperating with other people, but by actually focusing very much on being number one, and that's what it's all about. Nobody wants to be number two. And so there's this sense in which academics are almost the kind of the opposite of what you need to actually solve this problem. And at the same time, it's an institution like Columbia that has the breadth of academic expertise that is so essential to bring solutions to the problem, where you get these different people to talk to each other and work together. But it's also a very key feature of Columbia, really, so that's not good grammar. It's a key feature of Columbia that we've got global centers because the issue is global. And we need to actually understand not just what the pronouncements are in terms of global agendas, but actually what are the local solutions and regional solutions that are going to really work well for people. It's not about delivering from on high verdicts. It's about partnering with people from across the world. And so that's something that we can do through the global centers, and we're very excited to be doing so. So today we've got 5 panelists who I'm going to invite up onto to sit with me, and we're going to hear what they've been doing with the global centers around the issue of climate in particular. I'm going to lead a discussion with them, and then we're going to open it up to you to ask questions before we finally wrap up. So without any further ado, if I can get everybody to sit up here, and then I'll then introduce them. So this distinguished group comes from across the university. The first is Ruth DeFries, who I'm going to work my way across here from right to left. Ruth DeFries is a university professor, which, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly distinguished honor within Columbia University. She's a Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology. She is also the chair of the Earth Institute faculty. She is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship and many other academic awards, as well as author of over 100 scientific papers. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and immensely distinguished in many ways. Her current research focuses on how land use changes affect climate, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services, as well as human development. On her left is, from my side, oh. No, it's fine. We're going to we'll skip over you. On her left is Josh Fisher. He's the director of the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at the Earth Institute, as well as a faculty member. He has a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University, where he studied the ecological drivers of armed conflict. His current work focuses on natural resource management and governance as tools for conflict. Previously, he worked with conservation organizations, private sector firms, and government on natural resource governance and biodiversity conservation issues. Right, big round of applause for Josh. Okay. Lisa Sachs is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and a member of the Earth Institute faculty. She has established and now oversees the 3 areas of focus for her institute: investments in extractive industries, investments in land and agriculture, and investments in law and policy. She specializes in extractive industries, foreign investment, corporate responsibility, human rights, and integrated economic development. She earned her JD and MA in International Affairs from Columbia, where she was a James Kent Scholar and recipient of the Parker School Certificate in International and Comparative Law. Let's hear it for Lisa. And then we've got this guy, Jason Bordoff, who's Jason is a professor of professional practice in international and public affairs and founding director of CEPA's Center on Global Energy Policy. He is also an Earth Institute faculty member. His research and policy interests lie at the intersection of economics, energy, environment, and national security. He joined the Columbia faculty after serving as special assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate change on the staff of the National Security Council, and prior to that, holding senior policy positions on the White House's National Economic Council and Council on Environmental Quality. Jason has a law degree with honors from Harvard Law School. Jason. And last, but definitely not least, is Faye McNeil. Faye is a professor of chemical engineering at Columbia and a member of the Earth Institute faculty. Her research is focused on the chemistry and physics of atmospheric aerosol particles and ice in the environment and their roles in atmospheric chemistry, air quality, and climate. Besides improving our basic understanding of the Earth system, she and her research group are using the results of their work to improve large-scale models of atmospheric chemistry and climate. McNeil received her PhD in chemical engineering from MIT, where she was a NASA Earth System Science Fellow. Let's hear it for Faye. So with this amazing group of different faculty, you've got an opportunity to ask all kinds of questions about issues to do with climate change and how they're working across the globe with our various global centers. But we're going to kick off with each one of them giving a short presentation of a few slides, and in some cases no slides, actually just explaining a little bit about their work and how it ties into the global centers. And we're going to kick off with Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon, and a deep thanks to President Bollinger for his vision for the global outreach of Columbia, which has benefited all of us, and to everyone who has made that vision a reality over the last 10 years. It's quite an achievement. There are multiple ways for faculty to engage with the global centers. One is to dig deep and be engaged long-term with a single global center and engage deeply with the region. Another is to address an issue that affects many different regions around the world and use the global centers to interact around those issues. I think we're going to hear examples of both today. I'm going to do the former. I'm going to be digging deep in my engagement with the Mumbai Global Center in relation to climate and food security. So why engage with the Mumbai Center? Well, if you look at these projections about where we expect to see stresses and risks and where vulnerable populations are in the world, with a 1.5 degree increase in global mean temperature, which is the target that we are trying to stay below, although we know we are not going to meet that target. India, or South Asia, pops out as a hotspot in terms of risks to water stress, risks to crop yields, all kinds of different risks, heat stress, and also has a high density of vulnerable populations who are facing those stresses. So I see South Asia as the first line of defense for climate change impacts. This is serious, this is urgent, this is immediate, and it's about adapting to climate change to be able to live with these risks. Once we get to 3 degrees increase in global mean temperature, other places around the world pop up, and South Asia continues to face risks. So it's a very critical issue in that part of the world. But we can't think about climate and these risks outside of the larger context of a range of different development challenges. There are nutritional challenges with undernourishment and micronutrient deficiencies. There's water stress, even absent climate change. There's high vulnerability of many, many millions and millions of small-scale farmers. There's the issue of India being in the top 5 of greenhouse gas emitters. So we can't think about climate in isolation of all of these development issues. And when we use the global centers to deeply appreciate the regional perspectives from which we can identify our research questions, it's quite clear that development issues are front and center, and climate risk interacts with nearly all of them. I see food systems as central because 70% of the population in India is small-scale farmers and heavily relies on climate and also the nutritional challenges. So food systems are, we know, central to the climate risks and climate solutions, and particularly in India. So I want to share some of the work around these issues. So the current food system in India is a result of the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution was the concerted effort in the 1960s to increase production of cereals. Highly successful. India is a success story in that regard. Alleviated famine, took a lot of farmers out of poverty, many positive attributes of the Green Revolution. But there's also some consequences. And one of those consequences is that the focus of the Green Revolution was on 2 particular cereals, rice and wheat. And the traditional cereals, millets, sorghum, which are adapted to dry conditions, which are highly nutritious, didn't get the same kind of attention. So the food system has been highly concentrated towards those cereals at the expense of the C4 cereals. It's called C4 because that's the photosynthetic pathway, and that makes them use less water and more resilient to drought, also highly nutritious. So one of the legacies of the shift in these cereals, and the diets in India are heavily, heavily based on cereals, is rather alarming when we put this data together, that we like to think about improvements in nutrition, in consumption of iron per capita increasing, but what we see from the data is going in the other direction, that as diets became more heavily concentrated towards rice at the expense of those other cereals, as those dropped out of the diet, those other cereals were rich in iron, and we see a decline in per capita consumption, particularly in the rural poor, where iron intake is low and iron deficiencies are quite pervasive. So what do we do about this? There is a lot of thinking in India about bringing back the production of those cereals which have been dropping out of the diet, those C4 cereals. So in our lab, we put together the work, working with our Indian colleagues and with the Mumbai Center, to ask the question about, does this actually make sense to increase production of these traditional cereals in terms of multiple dimensions? Would that make food systems more climate resilient? Would it improve nutrition? Would it decrease water demand? What are those benefits at the same time without increasing land area, because there is no more land area to expand agriculture, or reducing overall calorie production? So there has been quite a focus on what the government now calls nutri-cereals, but our question was, is it possible, because the yields are generally lower, to get these benefits without sacrificing land or calories? So that's the question we set out to answer. And without taking you through the details of these results, the bottom line is we can, we can ask the question of where would we grow these other cereals if we wanted to reduce water demand as much as we could, if we wanted to increase iron production as much as we could, if we wanted to have the most climate resilient crops that we can. Is it possible? So this is a thought experiment. And the answer is, it is quite possible. to a limited extent, with strategic thinking about where those crops would be grown, and that whether you are optimizing to reduce demands on irrigation, or increase iron production, or increase climate resilience, or reduce greenhouse gases, whatever the objective is, we don't sacrifice the others. So that was our first question. Are we giving up something if we go for one of those other dimensions? So the shades here that you see here are for different assumptions about the land area that's available. But the point is, without dragging you through the details, is that no matter how we optimize, whether we optimize for nutrition or optimize for one of the environmental dimensions, that it is possible to achieve those benefits without losing production and without requiring more cropped area. So what do we do with these results? Well, it's quite ironic what is happening in India today, and some of you may know this, that these traditional cereals, these Nutri-cereals, are very trendy. They're a fad. If you see them you'll see them in fancy restaurants. You'll see them in grocery stores. The urban elite is eating these cereals. They're nutritious. They're good for diabetes. There's all kinds of good, wonderful things about them. They're also delicious. The rural poor, which is highly dependent on the government-run food security system, is heavily reliant on the nutritionally poor rice. And those are the populations which could most benefit from consuming these other traditional cereals. So while we've done this analysis to examine whether it is possible, realistic, to increase the production of these cereals, there's so much work to be done, so much field work, so much working with the Global Center to dig in deep with the farmers and with the consumers to understand how we could achieve the increase in this production, how we could improve diets, how we could use less water, how we could have a more resilient climate resilient food system, which is absolutely essential in this part of the world, as it is, particularly in this part of the world, important in all parts of the world. So this is our team. The workhorse was a postdoc, a Earth Institute postdoc, also a Data Science Institute postdoc. But one of the aspects that the global centers allow us to is to work deeply and long-term with in-country collaborators. And I can't emphasize how important that is if we're going to understand the place, as President Bollinger said, and if we're going to have an impact with our research. So I see one of the great benefits of the global centers is to help us cross this science policy bridge. How do we use our results? How do we ask the right questions? How do we take our scientific findings and use it to help make regionally relevant decisions that are based in the context of the region itself? And we all talk about the science policy bridge. We talk about that a lot. But it is actually quite hard to get up on that bridge and extremely hard to cross that bridge. And the global centers can certainly help with that, and they do. And we are engaged with the Mumbai Center on that very issue. So thank you very much. And I look forward to having your questions and hearing the other panelists.
Thank you, Ruth. Josh, over to you.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have been able to work with the Global Centers for the last 8 years and the projects that I'm going to be describing today. But thank you for having me. Today, I'd like to talk about water, climate change, and conflict in the Middle East. My research looks at the nexus of environmental systems and social systems, asking specifically what are the environmental drivers of conflict, as well as what the environmental impacts of conflict are on our natural systems, and importantly, how climate change comes in as a risk multiplier or amplifier. And so I asked 2 specific questions in my research. How can we use environmental management as a tool for conflict prevention or conflict management? And how can conflict resolution build our social resilience to climate change and help us design better adaptation strategies? And so we ask these questions around the world at my research center. But today, with the partnership of the Global Center in Amman, I want to focus on the Jordan River Basin, which is perhaps the most important water source in the Middle East. And it's the boundary between Israel, Jordan, the Palestinian territories, Syria, Lebanon. It's a really critical watershed, and it sits at the nexus of geopolitics, of social conflict, identity discussions at least, conflicts at worst, and climate change. So when we look at the historical system, starting in the headwaters in Lebanon and Syria, flowing through the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias or the Kinneret, depending on your political identity, flowing through the Jordan River, which is the boundary between Israel and Jordan, ultimately at its terminus in the Dead Sea, we see a trend toward increasing flows historically. However, when we look at the system today, we see a changing river system. In the headwaters, the system has stayed more or less stable. However, as we flow south, after water leaves the Sea of Galilee, we start to see dramatic water withdrawals and really dramatic decrease in water budgets in the Jordan River system. And this is due to a series of diversions on both sides of the borders for agriculture, industry, and municipal use. And so how did we get to this state? By the time the water reaches the Dead Sea, it's really no more than a trickle of agricultural runoff and municipal and human waste in this really important cultural site and this critical ecosystem. This is the breadbasket of the Middle East. So how did we get to this system, this state? Well, the history of the Jordan River system is really one of conflict. Starting in the 1950s, we see a series of unilateral water withdrawals, uncoordinated by the different riparians, and then a series of sort of tit-for-tat retaliatory policies around water management. And so that coupled with global politics, geopolitics, and regional politics, we see building mistrust that led to the failure to ratify several important water management policies that sought to coordinate activity in the Jordan River Basin. And so that led to, or contributed to at least, a series of military confrontations between the different riparians to try and get control over the Jordan River and its headwaters because it's such a critical watershed. And so when we think about the history of this water system, we really have to think about both the physical, the social, the economic, and the political implications that drive mismanagement of the water resources. And so by the time we get around to 2011, what we see through agricultural diversion and industrial use, particularly potash mining in the Dead Sea, is the shrinking or the dying of this important, critical cultural and ecological resource. When we look forward at some of the trends, we see some cause for concern. In terms of demand for water resources, this is the projected population growth in each of the different riparians. And then if we think about the current political climate, we see population transfers across these different countries, meaning the demand for water is increasing and projected to increase. But with climate change, we find ourselves in a really dire predicament where this is a hotspot, and it's a hotspot that shows some important patterns: shifting precipitation patterns, shifting seasonality, meaning that we see less water when we need it in the planting season, more water in the harvest season when we don't need it, leading to some real jeopardy for food security and economic security and national security, and ultimately some increases in the intensity of precipitation, meaning the infrastructure isn't set to handle these changing rainfall patterns. And so unsustainable management practices mixed with these climatological trends show that we're in a dire situation. If we're not careful, if we don't do something, then we could face a system in collapse, and not too far in the future. So the question is, what do we do about this? Well, certainly the region has its history of conflict, but importantly, the region also shows the use of conflict resolution strategies and practices to build cooperation among these different conflict parties and among these different political identities. And so while it's a history of conflict, it's also a history of rich cooperation and collaboration that give us important lessons on how to manage natural resources going forward. So beginning in the 1970s, in the face of recent conflicts, in the face of lack of coordinated management policies, the two riparians, the Israelis and the Jordanians, met year after year to hash out at the banks of the Jordan River water allocation strategies. These were informal talks, these were type 2 or type 3 diplomacy, but importantly, in the lack of formal agreements, the two riparians, who were historic enemies and at that point current enemies, were able to hash out coordinated management practices. And that history of cooperation progressively built a history of trust that ultimately helped contribute to the establishment of a peace agreement between Israel and Jordan in 1993, as well as the inclusion of environmental accords in the Oslo Agreement in 1994. And fast forward, the cooperation kept building and the collaboration kept building to the current day, where we see cross-border collaboration and cooperation on infrastructure, on water allocation, on water provisioning for refugees, a whole host of ways in which the different conflict parties continue to collaborate and cooperate. And so that holds some important lessons. And at my research center, we've been studying these lessons over time, and we've been able to, in partnership with the Global Center, turn those lessons into a curriculum to teach master's students here at Columbia University how to manage natural resources in the face of conflict. And so this is a partnership between the Amman Center as well as the Porter School for Environmental Studies and the Earth Institute, where we take graduate students from Columbia and from an Israeli institution, and to the extent possible, Arab students around the Middle East, to ask policymakers, practitioners, and resource managers how they do their job, how they manage to sustain social, economic, environmental life in the face of some real challenges. And so just quickly, we speak with habitat restoration experts managing degraded lands, with desalination managers and mega project managers on how they are using these new technologies to foster cooperation and change the political calculus. Extractive industry managers on how they're mitigating the environmental damage of these economically important activities. And land use planners on how they're working to implement across boundaries integrated land use policies. And so what have the impacts of this been? Well, a series of peer-reviewed and popular publications produced by the graduate students. But more importantly, a cadre of students who have been trained in mixing technical skill with conflict management skills to generate better policies and practices moving forward. And perhaps equally importantly, this program itself is an example of cross-border collaboration and peace building in a region where trust is at times scarce. This is a really important program showing that academic institutions at least can build trust across boundaries, train a new cadre of managers with expertise in technical and conflict management skills, and eventually, hopefully, build a more sustainable Middle East. And it's all due really to the real intense collaboration and vision of the global centers. So for those who are interested in this climate conflict nexus, in the spring we'll be hosting an event on campus on the intersection of climate change and conflict resolution. But for now, just want to say thank you.
Lisa.
Great. Thank you very much. Really wonderful to get to hear again about the work of my colleagues, but thank you to President Bollinger, to Alex, and especially to the collegiality of the global centers that we've had the privilege of working with. To tell you 1 second about the context, the center that I direct, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, we're a joint center of the Law School and the Earth Institute, and our focus is on the role of investment in sustainable development. Investment has critical impacts on sustainable development and addressing the climate crisis. On one hand, it can mobilize critical resources, technology, infrastructure, know-how, et cetera. We know that we need to mobilize a tremendous number of resources and investments to address climate change in particular, to invest in new energy generation, transmission, storage, et cetera. But on the other hand, investments can have detrimental environmental and social impacts, particularly in the host regions in which they operate. In the case of some investments in the consumption that can, of course, is exacerbating the climate crisis. So our focus is on the role of policies, practices, and the governance framework in shaping investment flows and how to maximize the contribution of investment to sustainable development and minimizing its negative impacts. So for today's purpose, I wanted to highlight our work on extractive industries. Extractive industries are central to the climate challenge for a number of interrelated reasons, which I will elaborate on. First is their own, extractive industries, to clarify, is oil, gas, and mining in particular, so industries where we're extracting resources from the ground. In the case of fossil fuel-based resources, their contribution to the climate crisis is obvious and well known. In the case of oil, natural gas, and coal. But in other extractive industries, as I'll highlight, they're also contributing to the climate crisis in terms of their emissions. They're very energy-intensive sectors, so I will highlight that. On the other hand, the energy transition is going to require a tremendous amount of minerals. So mined minerals and metals are going to be critical to the energy transition. I'll highlight that as well. And then third is that the sector is highly dependent on energy and water for the extraction and the processing of ore. And therefore, its interaction with energy systems and water systems is critical for climate change, both in terms of the resilience of the industries themselves, but also in terms of how they interact with the changing ecosystem around them. So we've been working especially on these challenges with the global centers in Chile and in Rio, where extractive industries, those that are facing these challenges are highly concentrated in Latin America in particular. Those are the ones that I will highlight. Oops. So as I mentioned, the energy transition requires complete decarbonization of the energy system by 2050. That means that we need to stop producing energy from oil, gas, and coal. That will have implications for the phase out of certain types of investments. But it also means that we need to scale up investments in new energy technologies, including, as I mentioned, storage, transmission, infrastructure, et cetera. This is going to require a tremendous demand for new types of minerals, or actually not new minerals, but growth in the demand for certain minerals: lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, silver, aluminum, to name a few. These graphics highlight in particular the growing demand for copper. It's illustrating that electric cars are going to need substantially more copper than gasoline cars. Wind turbines as well are very copper intensive. These are just a couple of the examples, but batteries, and all sorts of the transmission infrastructure, et cetera, needed for the new transitions are going to require a lot more minerals. The reason that that's particularly important is because of how we're going to access those minerals. We've already exhausted or depleted most of the world-class deposits of these minerals. In order to access the growing demand, to create the growing meet the growing demand for these types of minerals, we're going to have to access ores that are of a lower grade and that are harder to access. This is in part made possible because of new technologies that have been developed. But even so, it's going to require more energy to extract them, more water, et cetera. That's what these graphs are illustrating, that the lower the ore grade, the higher energy intensity of extracting, and the greater greenhouse gas emissions. So the overall energy needed by the mining sector is going to increase, and mining already is very energy intensive. Energy costs account for about 15 to 40% of overall operating costs of mines. And they use all different types of energy sources. They still use a lot of fossil fuel-based sources, coal, oil products, for instance, in transportation and in heating, coal and natural gas for refining and smelting, electricity for water pumping and for ventilation, et cetera. And the electricity they're using, which is about 40% of a typical mine use, if we take the average source of energy, that basically accounts for mining companies getting about 82% of their energy from fossil fuel-based sources. And again, this is likely to increase, so this is slated to increase both because of the need for more minerals and also because of the higher energy needs of accessing the lower grade ore. So to address the interrelated challenges of the increased energy needs and costs of mining projects, the increased carbon footprint, therefore, of mining operations, and the parallel deficit in energy access in the regions in which they're operating. Many of these projects are taking place in the context of regions that have low access among the communities to energy. We released a report called The Renewable Power of the Mine that shows how and why the mining sector can integrate renewable energy into their operations to reduce their own costs and hedge against the volatility of fuel prices, and to reduce their own emissions, and also to address some of the access issues of the communities in which they operate. We also highlight that this could be a competitive advantage for mines because a lot of consumers are looking to green the energy supply of their own end products. So of cell phones, of car batteries, et cetera, a lot of consumers are looking to the carbon intensity of the products. So the more that mines can integrate renewable energy and decrease their own carbon footprint, arguably the greater access to markets. And we found a number of notable examples of where this is being done in Latin America, which I will highlight in one moment. But as I mentioned, oops, sorry, didn't mean for that all to fly in like that. Mining is also very water dependent, and there are great risks of that from a number of perspectives. There are risks for the communities where projects are taking place because of the risks of contamination, or in the most serious cases, as happened in Brazil recently, devastation from tailings dam failures. But water scarcity also presents risks for the mining operations themselves, given how dependent they are on water. And again, these challenges are likely to be increased both because of the scale up of mining and harder to reach areas and lower grade ore, but also because climate change is exacerbating all water-related stresses, whether it's increased droughts, which can have an impact, obviously, on water scarcity and also over the conflict of water-related resources in mining regions, or increased floods, which can lead to and exacerbate the risks, for instance, of tailing dams failures and floods can also have other implications for mining resources, for mining operations, sorry. So one of the great opportunities presented by the energy and water intensity of extractive projects is the opportunity to develop shared use infrastructure. That is how the infrastructure needs and risks and considerations of the mining sector can align with those of the communities and the countries in which they're operating. So just to highlight examples, for instance, of desalination plants where it may be prohibitively expensive for regions, for instance, in the Antofagasta mining region of Chile, where there is not enough water for operations, not enough water for other users and other citizens in the area to build desalination projects for their own needs, but they can construct desalination projects, plants that work for multiple mines and that can partner with utilities in the region to expand access to clean water for the region. Similarly with other types of infrastructure, power infrastructure, which I highlighted. This is an example of shared use rail infrastructure where we looked at a case of that in Rio. So there are two interesting examples of this in Chile, for instance. In the Atacama Desert region in Chile, there's a desalination power plant that's operated by a third party and again supplies water both to the mining project and to the surrounding community. There's a dam project also in Chile, an Anglo-American project, where they have built photovoltaic panels that are floating on top of a tailing dam, which is powering the project with renewable energy and also it's slowing the evaporation of the water and allowing the reuse of the water to meet some of the water needs of the project. So just to quickly note that these are good practices for mining projects, but they are far from common. One of the reasons for that we've been looking at with the Brazil project is that the standards for sustainable projects are far from common in this sector. There are no common definitions of what is needed to be a sustainable project. And a lot of existing definitions and approaches don't focus on some of these critical aspects of business engagement with supply chains and stakeholders and policymakers. So we've been working with the Rio Center to develop a framework for assessing alignment of business practices with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, looking at whether the product is consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, whether the production processes are aligned, whether the value chain is aligned, and whether there are other aspects of corporate citizenship whether the company is overall a good corporate citizen. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Jason.
Okay, I have slides, so I'll just sit here if that's okay and talk for a few minutes. And so I think what I'm going to do is a little different, A, because I don't have slides, and B, because I'm not going to focus on just one project we've been working on, but just tell you a little bit about the work of the Center on Global Energy Policy and why that work is enhanced so meaningfully by the existence of and collaboration with the global centers. As you heard, my background is also a little different from my colleagues. So my career has been moving back and forth between policy making or policy research. And you can usually guess which of those two things I'm doing based on which party is in power. So right now I'm doing policy research. And when I left the Obama White House and decided to come to Columbia to build a new, the Center on Global Energy Policy, what it lacks in a catchy acronym is at least descriptive. Kind of tells you what we're working on: global energy and policy. And Columbia was really an extraordinarily attractive home to do it. It's turned out to be even more attractive than I had realized because of the commitment from Lee and so many others to make sure that the academic research done here is really focused on delivering solutions to real world problems. And the global centers was a big part of that. Climate change, more than almost any other problem, is the most global of problems. That's what makes it so difficult, right? It is the ultimate collective action problem. It doesn't matter where a ton of greenhouse gas emissions come from. And that's why when you're thinking about what we do at the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is how do we collaborate with faculty on research projects across the university toward the goal of identifying implementable solutions that move the needle on emissions at a gigaton scale. Like what actually makes a difference and moves the needle. And there's not actually, there's a lot of stuff that's going on and a lot of stuff that's happening that doesn't. So extraordinarily exciting news. In the last 10 years, solar costs are down 90%, wind costs are down 50%. Electric vehicle sales are up fourfold in the last 3 years. 2/3 of the investment in new power generation last year went into low or zero carbon energy, electricity. And coal use went up, and gas use went up, and oil use went up. Like those two things can all be true at the same time. And emissions continue to rise each and every year, and we don't need to just stop them from rising. We need to eventually, pretty quickly, take them to zero unless we have solutions to remove CO2 from the air, which I think will be part of the solution in some capacity. But you're taking them pretty close to zero if you're serious about any of the goals that we're talking about and that our climate science colleagues at the faculty tell us we need to be talking about. So the value of the global centers is, many things, but let me just offer some examples of one. It is perspective of what a global problem looks like. And it looks really different in Bangladesh than it does in Berkeley, California. And to be able to think about solutions, either policy or financial, with finance community, insurance industry, technological, how those look different around the world, whether it's our ability to do that with policy, with partnerships, and with people. I'll say a word about each of those things. So we spend a lot of time thinking about policy design. We have a major research initiative, for example, on carbon tax design and implementation. I think that research shows, and I personally believe, that a price on carbon is a necessary, not sufficient, but necessary part of a solution that puts us on a pathway to deep decarbonization. We've done a huge amount of work on how you would do that in the US. We're working now with many members of Congress on modeling carbon pricing bills, host of design issues to think about. What do you do with the revenue? How do you deal with competitiveness impacts? What level do you set it at? We model that a $50 a ton price on carbon would reduce emissions in the US by 2030 relative to 2005 by 40%. That's a big reduction in emissions. And I actually think people don't fully appreciate how big a difference a carbon price, a well-implemented carbon price, would make. But there are big, as I said, design issues. One of those is distributional. How do you deal with the adverse distributional implications? The fact that it'll hit low-income people harder than high-income people. And the answer to that depends on what you do with the revenue. So you think through how you could design it to offer a rebate to people or to lower other regressive taxes. Then we sit at global centers around the world, as we've done, and we think through how you would design policy around the world and have conversations like, you're assuming a well-functioning government that has the ability to collect tax revenue and has the administratively possible, that it's administrable to be able to take that revenue and rebate it to people because you know who people are and you have a banking system and a financial system to get it to people. You have a level of trust and governance in the existing governments there to return revenue to people. Like, that's not the reality we live with at all. So you're talking about an entirely different solution set, and you start from a completely different place. There's been a much greater focus with a carbon price or on climate policy generally with the very helpful focus of the Green New Deal on equity and justice and issues of transition. And so we just did a paper. I'm just going to give you some examples of stuff we've been doing. We did a study recently on the risk of fiscal collapse in coal communities in the United States. There's been a focus on coal workers, not quite as much of a focus on the risk to the municipal finances of coal-dependent communities and what policy solutions might be to do that. Now, we can solve that problem because we have 60,000 coal workers in the United States relative to 800,000 in the 1920s. Then we have that discussion in the Mumbai Center, where India has 500,000 people who work in coal, 1.5 million who work in the railways. What's the number one thing the railways move in India? It's coal. You're not going to solve this problem as a matter of political economy, nevertheless good policy design, unless you develop a solution to that. That's not climate policy. That's economic policy, and that's just the reality of what it means to take issues like this seriously. And so now we've had conversations and have written some papers and worked with people there about how you would do that. We did a paper recently on the role of natural gas in deep decarbonization. So, it's true that over the last decade, the US has seen an emission decline more than most other countries because cheap gas has led to coal to gas switching. That doesn't tell us what the role of gas needs to be in a deeply decarbonized world, and that's a hugely controversial issue. And we see an increasing concern about that because we're running out of room in the carbon budget. Have that conversation at the Nairobi Center, which we've had, where they're about to have a massive windfall offshore East Africa for natural gas resource development, and tried to suggest that maybe we don't want to develop these resources, notwithstanding the enormous wealth that lies in the ground, because of the historic responsibility we bear. I mean, this is a stock pollutant. It's not a flow pollutant. Once a ton is up there, it's up there. So how much of this problem is caused by emissions from the US, Europe, elsewhere? That's a totally different conversation. We had that conversation recently in Africa, and the quote that stuck with me was someone who said, "We're worried about the end of the month, not the end of the world. And you need to help us design solutions that work for us." And telling us like there's no room for gas, that's not going to work for us. It doesn't work in China, where one of the greatest things done for public health in the last 3 years around the world, and maybe Faye can talk about this, is Chinese policy to phase out the use of coal for heat, coal-fired boilers. We don't think of coal really for heat in the US, we mostly use it for electricity, but there's a huge source of coal demand in China. So huge government policy, phase that out, massive benefits in terms of reduction in air quality, air pollution, climate change benefits as well. They couldn't have done that without the fact that liquefied natural gas imports into China went up 50% year on year each of the last 3 years. So when you think about the debate over US LNG exports, and should we be supplying natural gas to the world, and what's the role of gas in the carbon budget, which is running out quickly, I just think it's really important to be able to partner with people and have these conversations and develop policy solutions that work outside of, again, New York or California. So, Brookline, Massachusetts, Berkeley, California, there may be other cities now too that have banned the use of natural gas for heating. We can debate whether that's a sensible policy solution in Brookline or Berkeley. It's not when you're using firewood and dung for cooking, and like switching to LPG would be a massive win. So we just need to really, I can go give more examples, I'll stop there, about the importance of the global centers to help us do our work and design policy solutions that sort of bring that global perspective to bear. The same is true with the Belt and Road Initiative. So we just published a paper, we've done a lot of work on Belt and Road, we've convened in Beijing several times. We just had a paper on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So US policymakers like to attack Belt and Road for being this nefarious thing, and it is concerning for lots of reasons. I haven't yet seen a policy alternative put on the table. So if you're going to go into Pakistan and say, we think it would be better for a variety of reasons, climate being one of them, if you had a pathway to deal with the fact that the electricity goes out 13 hours a day, you think it's hard to like get electric vehicles, you know, like the lights going out in California now and rolling blackouts might be a barrier to EV take-up. Try to sell EVs in a place where power goes out 13 hours a day. But we have a solution that works better for you in terms of climate, local air pollution, more economic. How do you design that? And what is the role, say, of natural gas or LNG imports in that? And can you do that completely with renewables, which I think the math is really hard to make work. So we need to put policy solutions on the table that really take account of what the conditions are on the ground. And our ability to design those, deliver those to the State Department, deliver those to some of the people who were in Madrid this week, which we've done, is significantly enhanced by the partnerships we have and the convening we can do with the global centers. That puts a broader set of solutions on the table where you start to think about carbon capture, carbon utilization, direct air capture, and negative emissions, which is also an area we've done work on, but Colombia is a leader on. The same with advanced nuclear technology, which again looks different in different parts of the world than it does, say, in upstate New York. We have, I mentioned policy, I mentioned people. We have scholars at the Energy Center who are based around the world at some of the global centers, and one of them who's based in Beijing is doing a study now on China's nuclear strategy, which is not just an environmental issue, obviously. I worked at the National Security Council. That's a huge issue for US foreign policy and national security when we see today that the countries that are leading in nuclear technology are Russia and China. So how do we think about approaching that? We're working with some Chinese universities and partners now on hydrogen because we've done a lot of work on the hard to abate sectors. We talk a lot about solar and wind. They provide electricity. Electricity is 25% of emissions. We talk about electrifying passenger transport, passenger cars. Cars are 25% of oil use. So a lot of the work we've done is on some of the harder to abate sectors like heavy industry. How do you create low carbon, high temperature heat? And what role might carbon capture or hydrogen or other solutions play in that? And a lot of that work needs to be done outside the US. We've organized partnerships that I think are really valuable. So one issue related to natural gas we've worked on is the issue of methane leakage and flaring. That looks like, has a certain perspective in the US. We're actually organizing a workshop in January in Texas on flaring with state regulators and companies and environmental groups and academics. But the progress that's been made on methane emissions globally, and there has been some, that's been a lot of the major oil and gas companies, the Shell, BP, Total types, sort of paying much closer attention to this issue. That's a pretty small share of global production. If you really want to make progress on that issue, you need to engage national oil companies in this conversation. And so we're doing that at the Amman Center in March. We've done it we did it in Paris 2 weeks ago, bringing producers from the Middle East and from other parts of the world together, from the Gulf countries, to help raise visibility, educate about this issue, help people understand why it matters, and why actually the solutions to it are pretty achievable if people understand it and can kind of implement best practices. So those are just I can go on, but I'll just stop there. I think I'm just about to use my time. Examples of the kind of issues we're working on and why the ability to deal with this most global of issues in terms of policy design, the partnerships we can build, the people we can hire, and just the perspective that we have to have is much, much stronger because we have these network of global centers to work with.
Thanks so much. Faye.
Do we have the? Oh, okay.
Who's got the clicker? I don't know.
Okay, thanks everybody. It's really an honor to be here on the stage with such a fascinating group of people and to hear everything that's going on and the deep engagement that the Columbia Global Centers have with every aspect of the research we've heard about today. So what I'll be talking about is a very new, highly interdisciplinary initiative through the Earth Institute, focusing on solutions-oriented work to improve air quality on the ground in cities in Africa and India. Our group is called the Clean Air Toolbox for Cities, and at some point we realized we have researchers who are experts in their domains with regards to air pollution in really all corners of the university. So We're talking from the law school to the medical school to engineering, where my base is, to Lamont, to public health. And it's really been the vision of this to get all of us together. It's over 20 research groups to coordinate, start speaking the same language, and work in a very local level to improve air quality. And when we're talking about air pollution and air quality, we're talking about particulate matter and certain harmful gases like ozone in the atmosphere that can damage human health. And of course, these components also are part of climate. They have their own climate effects, but they also share some sources with greenhouse gases like CO2. So many of the same activities like burning fuel for energy, et cetera, have climate impacts as well as air quality impacts. And we'll talk a little bit about how these things tie together. So poor air pollution or poor air quality is really a global public health crisis. So it's estimated to cause more than 7 million deaths per year, premature deaths. And you can see that a lot of the impact is focused in South Asia, and in Africa. Sources of air pollution include transportation, industrial activity, biomass fuel, and natural sources like dust storms and the like. Part of the cruel reality of all of this is that in the same places where development-wise and economically the populations are more vulnerable to the impacts of poor air quality, there's also a lack of data for us to understand the depth of the problem and be able to quantify any progress that's made. So this is a figure from a paper from a group in Canada showing just the number of air pollution monitors per million people. And you can see that in particular across Africa and South Asia, there's a gap of data that needs to be addressed. And without this information, we can't really track pollution back to its sources, identify the most effective ways to improve air quality, and these things ultimately drive political change as well. So at Columbia, we're really lucky. This is a fantastic university in the sense that we have expertise along all areas of this continuum between the sources of air pollution, how they're transformed and transported in the atmosphere to lead to the air quality emergency episodes that we see so much of in, say, in India and Beijing lately. And then the details of the way that air pollution affects our bodies and leading to adverse health outcomes. And then, of course, every stage of this problem has climate impacts and feedbacks. So you can think of the sources being impacted by climate, whether we're talking about increased dust storms due to climate change or heat waves leading to increased use of air conditioning and therefore increased use of energy and a positive climate feedback in that way, all the way to the health effects themselves. So a person who's suffering from extreme heat will respond differently to the insult of poor air quality than someone who's not. And then all of this is existing in the backdrop of the economic reality, development, and then the law and policy context of what's happening in each individual place. And so the group that we've pulled together here at Columbia includes experts from all of these angles, and we're doing our best to coordinate and work with cities to have an impact to start to address this problem. So the plan that our group has put together has 3 phases, and this is it seems quite theoretical on the page, but as many of my colleagues have mentioned, something that the global centers help us do is be grounded in the reality of the local situation in each case. So we brainstormed what do we have to offer, but then the reality of the individual cities that we're working in is that maybe we can jump in at phase 2, if there's already a good data groundwork set up in a particular city, or maybe the concerns of local policymakers are really focused on source identification, and so we can step in and start our work there. But in a big picture sense, our plan has 3 phases. So first, closing that deadly air pollution gap that helps us understand the base of the problem and start to get the word out about the health risks of air pollution, which is really the foundation for political mobilization, which is phase 3. And then closing the knowledge gap both includes using the data to understand the extent of health impacts locally, but also source identification, and then, in a broader sense, capacity building, right? So we want local technical expertise to be strong enough that, any work that we lay down can carry on without Columbia's involvement afterwards. Okay. So I don't want to run too much over, but I want to highlight a few pilot activities that we have going on this year. So the co-PI of this project is Dan Westervelt. He's somewhere in the room. I can't see with the lights. But he is spearheading a number of activities in 6 cities across Africa. And then I'm doing some work in Kolkata, India. Much of what we're doing is quite focused on the data gathering side of things, but we're also holding some capacity building workshops. We're also, of course, in a fundraising phase at this moment, which is another big focus of what we're doing this year. So I want to highlight at this time how the Columbia Global Centers have been involved and really helped take the lead in some of the activities that we're doing. So this summer, Dan collaborated with the CGC in Nairobi to hold an air pollution roundtable meeting, which was really phenomenally successful. So there were participants from Kenya and Uganda there. And this was really a meeting bringing together local experts on air pollution and climate to kind of take the state of what the activities are there, build the groundwork for future collaborations and work of this sort. Other meetings of this sort we expect to convene over the next year or 2 will include more capacity building kind of workshops, including tutorials and more knowledge exchange. I just wanted to say that CGC Nairobi has also been fantastic in helping us identify potential local collaborators and local hosts who might be interested in sponsoring or just having air pollution data collection equipment on their premises and whatnot. CGC Mumbai has also been quite active in this area, so they have an ongoing theme in environment and sustainability, which has included some lecture series and other activities. They've also had an interesting activity going on in collaboration with Urban Works. So they've had a design challenge for the last 2 years that's fostered activities with startups in India. Last year, there were also students from Columbia involved in this. And this year's design challenge is focused on sustainability in cities, which has a climate and air pollution angle. So I guess I'll wrap up there and we can have questions.
Thanks very much, Ben. Well, that's spectacular. It's just a little kaleidoscope of the amazing stuff going on here at Columbia. We could have brought together these people are very distinguished, but we have many more without being rude to our panel. So it's interesting just to get these little snapshots of what people are doing across the university and how they're engaging with the global centers so effectively. So I'm going to ask a few questions, choreographed questions right now, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But at some point, if we run out of hands and all the rest of it, I'm going to ask each of you, just if you can bear it in your mind while you're listening to other people, what one thing each of you would like to see to build upon what's already happened with the global centers, and what one thing you think would make a difference in terms of Columbia's ability to do something even bigger. So just put that in the back of your mind right now. But let's just kick off with a question about climate change in particular. To what extent do any of you particularly feel that the narrative around climate change, the interest, the sense of urgency, the sense of concern and panic maybe, is changing, or to what extent maybe people are just feeling like giving up because it just looks like such an incredibly difficult problem, as Jason was outlining. Has any of you picked up that by working in your various communities around the world, that people are getting more urgent about it, more sense of we've got to get something done, and more engagement, or are people seeing less engagement? Ruth, do you want to kick off?
I'll start off by sharing my perceptions of working in India, which I have done for quite a long time now, and that it wasn't that long ago, not many years ago, when it was very difficult to even bring up the topic of climate because it's Western-driven. The West is responsible for historical emissions. It's somebody else's problem, and it was very hard to talk about climate up until not very long ago, just a few years ago. But that has changed drastically, in that now there is quite a lot of conversation around climate and water, because water is such an important issue. Climate and agriculture, vulnerability of farmers, migration, all of these issues that are so related to climate, and that conversation has really taken hold. There's also been such a focus on renewables in India and other climate mitigation strategies, but I'd say most of the concern and conversation is around climate adaptation and how's the country going to live with these risks. So it has changed quite a bit from kind of a Western problem, somebody else's problem to think about, to a real immediate adaptation concern.
Lisa, do you have any?
Yeah, so to speak of one constituency that we work with quite a bit is the private sector. And I think the attention to climate from the private sector has dramatically increased from my perspective in the past 3 years, particularly since the adoption of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, which I think explicitly recognize the roles and responsibilities of the private sector. So I think they're on a steep learning curve, but also really open to and eager for to work with the scientists and institutions to better integrate some of the climate science. So just for instance, just last week, a couple weeks ago, Alliance Bernstein asset manager partnered with Lamont Doherty to better understand climate modeling and climate risks and how that can be relevant for their first of all, for their portfolio management, but also for their engagement with the companies in which they're in their portfolio. I think that was quite new. I don't think that would have happened several years ago. And on the side to which I was speaking about a bit more, I also think land-based physical investments are feeling the impacts of climate in a way that they weren't necessarily earlier. That's related, of course, to more extreme weather events. So I think that in addition to the greater sense of roles and responsibilities, I think there is also much greater attention to resilience in physical infrastructure, mitigating and closing kind of the exposure to climate risks on the ground. So I'm not sure that they're yet asking the right questions or necessarily taking all the appropriate actions, but I think that the interest and openness to have that discussion has changed a lot in recent years.
Yeah. Josh, any quick, we need to actually
Yeah, just very quickly. I have the fortune to work with asset managers and farmers and conservation managers who operate on not these long-term projections, but more the day-to-day, how to actually manage resources in the face of climate change, which is happening today. And so on the day-to-day, at that technical grounded level, I see a lot of collaboration and cooperation, and it gives me a lot of hope in our ability to, both in our technical solutions as well as our political and institutional solutions, develop cooperative and collaborative patterns that can help us learn how to continue to adapt as we move forward.
So is sort of resilience and adaptation, is that becoming much more of the narrative of working with governments as well as local? I mean, Jason, have you actually found that people are much more receptive now than they used to? Faye, I'm giving you a break after having just come back to you in a minute. Jason, do you have actually a strong sense that national governments are actually taking this much more seriously now? Or how does it work, particularly in China?
Yes and no. I mean, what are you talking about in Madrid this week? We're talking about the massive gap between ambition and rhetoric and reality. And that's what we see from a lot of governments around the world, a pretty large gap between the ambition and the reality. So I agree with my colleagues that the level of attention, urgency, and concern with climate change is rapidly escalating. It's not clear that that manifests itself into actions on the ground. And I think the one place I'd push back a little bit is that I think you see this a really good article in the FT last week, how China went from leader to laggard on climate change. And we've done a lot of work, including with the Global Center, on what China's actually doing. We have an annual guide to Chinese climate policy. I feel like every day you read the newspaper, China's leading on climate, they're lagging on climate, they're building coal, they're not building coal, like what's actually happening? So we created a resource, we have a whole website called like Chinese Guide to Chinese Climate Policy that answers those questions with a team we use the Beijing Global Center for. And I think the truth is that China's still committed to climate change, but it's only one of several competing priorities for Beijing. And right now, other priorities are taking precedence, like bolstering the economy, maintaining employment, ensuring energy security. And you see that not just in China, but rising, populist movements around the world that are really making it difficult and creating constraints on the ability of governments to put policy in place that does have a cost. I mean, climate policy has a cost. It's much less than the cost of climate change, but it does have a cost. And there really is a concern, what we see not just in the streets of Paris, but elsewhere, with whether the people will be willing to accept that right now.
Yeah. So is there a sort of sense that in terms of, I was quite struck by someone's comment this morning about India versus the US. So in the US, of course, we think that maybe the national level, the globe, the presidential level, there's not much leadership on climate change right now. That's probably a bit of an understatement. But on the other hand, you've got city mayors and states really rising up to the challenge and really engaging with the whole issue in a fantastically exciting way. And of course, private philanthropy is playing a major role in that as well. And actually trying to figure out how to close down coal mines and all this kind of stuff in America. And it's in other countries, in India, it sounds like it's actually the president or the government at the top of the whole country, subcontinent, that's actually providing the leadership. And it's actually, there are more problems on the local level. And have you noticed anything in particular about what you might regard as good practice and things we might learn from in terms of governments responding to the climate change thing, where you think these guys have got it right and we should actually follow from that and try and figure out how we can take that best practice elsewhere?
Well, command and control government's sort of pretty effective when China makes a decision about a target it wants to hit or it wants to lead the world in, electrification of vehicles or the solar industry. It does it. It can get there. It's got issues with deploying its own policy regionally, where regional governments sometimes have different incentives. But that's been pretty effective. In places where availability of some low-cost alternatives with a carbon price has been deployed, the UK is probably the prime example. We've seen the UK basically get off of coal now, which is pretty remarkable. We've seen leadership in different parts of Europe, especially Scandinavia. But again, these are countries that have the resources and the means to do this. Go ahead.
Just to add in an alarming trend that we are also observing at our center, as you mentioned, one of our work streams on investment law and policy, which is the use of and the relevance of international trade and investment agreements, of which there are 3,000, and how they can impact measures that governments need to take, including on climate action. So we're kind of following governments that are taking meaningful climate action, like the government of Alberta, the past government of Alberta, that had announced a coal phase out and had delayed regulatory approval of an oil sands project. France, which had tried to pass a law to ban continued extraction of oil and gas within France. Netherlands, which just announced a coal phase out of their coal-fired power plants. And in each of those cases, the companies have brought lawsuits against the government challenging those measures, which I hope alarmist in fearing that that's going to cause a chill on the types of government action that's needed. So.
And your point about subnational is important too. Obviously in the US, California, New York, there are states that are really, I think, leading the way, making a dent in emissions, but also demonstrating what it looks like to actually put smart policy in place that can reduce emissions, not destroy the economy necessarily at the same time, and it can be a model for others to follow.
So Faye, your work on air pollution, this takes, if you like, the climate rhetoric very much down to the issue of public health and people's real lives, where cities, of course, get involved, like Delhi or whatever. Have you seen a greater degree of engagement around this issue, in particular in recent years, with certain parts of the world that are keen to move forward? It sounded like.
Right. So in many areas in India, they're experiencing climate emergency year after year, and so the awareness has really shot up, I would say, in the last 3 years. But it's, from people I've spoken to across the country, regionally the attitudes differ, socioeconomically, people's attitudes towards it vary. I think that an interesting issue is that many of the cities are responding with just short-term policy approaches. So, okay, let's wait until there's an emergency episode and then apply a kind of unsustainable approach to dealing with that. Whereas a little bit more long-term planning is needed. And then also there's an interesting opportunity, as many of these areas are developing their climate policy and also tackling an air quality emergency. These two things, in some ways, with careful design, there can be co-benefits of the policies, but in some ways, there's trade-offs between air quality and climate as well, so they can't be considered separately.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, we'll open it up to the audience in a second, but do you think, any of you, that Columbia's not yet taking full advantage of our ability to engage with the global centers and what we can do, and other things that, we'll talk about the global centers later, but right now within Columbia University, are you aware of particular things we should be doing differently back here in terms of, taking our expertise and sharing it more broadly? What's your own experience of that? Because it always strikes me that we have these great ideas, and academics are typically individuals and all the rest of it, being brilliant, and that's why they get tenure and all the rest of it. And actually, here we actually need to think more strategically about what the university as a whole might do. And do you think there are things we need to change in Columbia about maybe making that shift towards from the individual academic to the strategic vision of the university under the leadership of Lee Bollinger?
Well, I'll channel the students through my comments, and that is that the students are so passionate and engaged with the issue of campus sustainability and divestment, and they care very deeply about that, and they rightly make the point that we talk about these issues and it really starts at home.
Right. I think that's very true. But I just wonder whether, in terms of coordination of our activity across the university on climate, which of course we've been thinking about on the climate school idea, whether you think there are some easy wins that we're actually not taking full advantage of ourselves as an institution yet.
I can speak. Oh, please.
No, go ahead.
Josh, go ahead.
I can speak from my experience. I came originally as a postdoc and then transitioned to associate research scientist and have been on the professional research track. And my experience across that trajectory is that there are brilliant researchers in the PhD, at all levels of Columbia, but particularly the PhD, postdoc, and ARS levels that are really eager to work together and eager to do so in not necessarily an interventionist approach, but an applied approach to interdisciplinary research. The challenge for them is, one, navigating a system as large and complex as Columbia, but also the incentive structures for a postdoc versus an ARS to be able to work in an interdisciplinary team on applied policy relevant research. Those incentives don't necessarily align with the promotion track. And so the two challenges and potential solutions are better coordination among that cadre that are really eager and young and skilled at the newest techniques and methodologies, as well as some way of aligning the incentive structures to reward that.
That's great. Okay, Jason, just quick.
So I just mentioned part of something we've thought a lot about at something called the Center on Global Energy Policy is what it means to be global and when we're doing policy. And does that mean our mission and our definition of success is helping people here understand what's happening in the rest of the world? Does it actually mean developing the capacity to design and develop policy recommendations for governments and policymakers around the world, the way we're doing now, somewhat effectively on Capitol Hill? that takes you to a pretty different place in terms of how you would use global centers, what kind of people you want to hire. We've built a really excellent team of research scholars. Some, as I mentioned, are based outside the US. I've talked with Safwan about the vision we have, which is actually having a network of global scholars using this global centers as a base from which they can work. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, the ability for that to inform our work and bring a perspective, that's hard to implement. It's hard to build a culture that's dispersed like that, to build a team that's around the world. I mean, organizations much larger have challenges doing that. And then to know how to implement it, from issues of visa to how to attract the right talent locally. And it takes a lot of work to get that right, which is why we've just taken small steps in that direction. But I think that's a really exciting opportunity.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you don't ask questions, I'm going to pick on each one of you. If there are mics, I think, at either side here. Is that the idea? So if you want to ask a question, could you make it really short? Because I think there may be quite a few people with questions. If you can make it really short and don't so much give us an essay. Just a short question would be very, very helpful. Then there's more time for people to answer questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Thought you were helping.
great.
Thanks for being here. My question concerns public health. What regional and class distinctions, if any, are there regarding how pollution impacts children?
Okay, Faye, I guess that's...
Yeah, air pollution is a well-known environmental justice issue, right? So both in the US and worldwide, often places where people with fewer resources are living have deeper air pollution problems. And along with that goes with more health problems and probably also less capacity to, less health care. So there's definitely a socioeconomic angle to all of that, and it's a major concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So over here, we're going to switch either way.
Hi. As far as recognizing the complexity of all these things going together, don't you find that the global youth movement and probably, as Jason mentioned, the Green New Deal of Bernie Sanders, raising that to the presidential level right now, has been helpful? Don't you think that has been helpful? Both of those things, the global youth movement and...
Lisa, why don't you, let's take that.
Yeah, absolutely. When we were speaking to Alliance Bernstein about kind of projections that may not be captured by the models, this was one of the things that I highlighted, that the youth are mobilizing in ways that they weren't. And around, so in Chile, that protest was started by youth. Greta, of course, has made waves. So yeah, I think absolutely they're not going to stand. They're rightfully angry and anxious, and I think that there's a high likelihood that there'll continue to be movements that are pushing, that are pushing and will continue to push policymakers to take decisive action. That's my expectation and hope.
Jason, do you want to?
Sure. We had an Earth Institute faculty meeting today and saw some polling data, which is consistent with what I've seen just about people in New York City. You ask the majority of people, do they think climate change is real, caused by human activity? The answer is yes. If you ask how important it is to them relative to other issues like the economy, jobs, healthcare, it's pretty low. That's changing, and it's very different for the younger cohorts than the older cohorts. So I think as a former policymaker, what I see when I see that is you're never going to get policymakers to take decisive action, no matter how much people say they care about climate change. It's number 10 or 20 on their priority list. So mobilizing, whether it's through the Green New Deal or activism in the streets or whatever, to elevate the level of urgency is a necessary condition for political action. Then what is necessary is that the political action is actually something that makes a big dent in emissions. And what I worry about, to be honest, is some of the mobilization I see around things that are important and mobilizing sort of rallying cries and visible symbols, but actually aren't the things that if you kind of wanted to roll up your sleeves and make policy that would move the needle in the biggest possible way on emissions, it may not be the same thing. So the fact that in 2012 and 2016 there wasn't a single question asked in any presidential debate about climate change, and now CNN did 7 full hours on climate, clearly that's a good thing. And what I really want to do, and what a university like this should be doing, is helping people say, once you have that urgency and momentum, what do we do? And what are the things that will make the biggest dent in this problem in the most cost-effective way? That's what I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Okay. Josh, did you want to come in on that?
No, I'll just dovetail on that, actually, to say that the global centers hold a unique position here to be able to create mergers or synergies between local civil society and these movements that are rising with technical expertise that is housed in institutions like Columbia University, with local policymakers at multiple levels in the regions that host them. And it's only through sort of that synergy that we can get to policies that are practical, technically feasible, and implementable. And then the merger with civil society, hopefully sustainable over time. And so the centers are really uniquely positioned.
Okay, another question over here. So.
Thank you. It's been a challenge. Thank you very much for your tremendous presentations. It's been really enlightening. A quick question. Talking about implementation, do you get to cooperate with corporations, global or locally? For example, IBM advertises that they are tackling air pollution or climate change. Do they provide funding, or do you have cooperations with local or global ones? Thank you.
Who wants to talk about engagement? Yeah,
I'm happy to. It links to our work with the Rio Center. We certainly do work with corporations that are genuinely interested in really understanding what the expectations are, what the opportunities are, and who are really engaged. So the Rio Center, for instance, helped convene industry leaders with civil society leaders and with academics in Rio. We're bringing that to New York as well to bring those industry perspectives, resources, and commitments together with the science and the movements. And I genuinely believe that the global centers are really well positioned to do that locally as well, particularly because the interests, the players are so different in each of these regions. So that's been a really wonderful experience for us to get to work in the regions, bringing them together. But so for sure, we work quite a bit with corporations.
Yeah.
I'll add.
Yeah, sure.
I mentioned in my talk there's a very heavy data science and data component to what we're doing with regards to air pollution, and that's also important for climate. And so a number of tech companies have become involved in that for different motivations. But Google has done some work in this area. Microsoft, Uber, there's a clear interest there.
Great. Okay, let's keep going. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been very informative. I wanted to pick up on the suggestion earlier about real change occurring or starting at home. And my question is, this time next year, when we have jettisoned the current administration, I'm interested in, what we are going to find in terms of real damage and how we're going to walk that back.
Right. Who wants to take that on? Jason.
Like a Jason.
I think there's been...
Jason, you'll be back in the White House.
Well, I love my job. I think there's been some damage in terms of the civil service within the government, which is extraordinary. We've seen that recently on television in a pretty high-profile way, probably more at EPA than some other agencies. But there has been brain drain, and I think the capacity of agencies like the EPA needs to be rebuilt. There's some of that in the regulatory sense. So like, roll back a fuel economy standards. There's a set of things that you would want to reverse the reversal before going further. There's actually fewer of those than people might think. I mean, it's hard to regulate. You got to go through a 2-year notice and comment process. You need to defend your regulation in court against court challenge. It's hard to deregulate too. And this administration's actually lost a fair amount in the courts. So, I remember the headline in January 2013, Trump administration opens like every acre of the federal offshore to drilling. How much of the federal offshore is open today to drilling that wasn't open before? 0. Like, nothing's changed. So there is a set of ways in which the headlines have been a little worse than the reality, but nonetheless, there's going to be work to do to put many of these regulations back in place. And then the important thing is to go much further.
Great. Okay, let's have another question over here.
Thank you. My name is Richard Ruzzo. I just want to say thank you to Columbia University for pulling together this panel and informing the community. My question, there was a slide that was put up about sensors, building up the sensor network. And so what investments do we need to make in this world of we're interconnected, the Internet of Things? You know, at the local level, can we legislate the implementation to force that buildup of sensors, and what are those sensors that we need to put in place to move the needle forward?
Sure. So in the US and many other countries with really well-developed air pollution policies and the resources, there actually already is a sensor network of government-grade air pollution sensors. So EPA does this for us here. What we're exploring in other areas is the potential use of low-cost sensors. You know, it's a little bit more experimental, requires a little bit more data science expertise, and domain expertise about air pollution in particular to make sure that the data that's coming out is usable. Certainly local investment once the initial groundwork is laid will be necessary to keep that going. But it's often difficult to say, like, well, where will the money come from to address that data gap, right? So in past experience, it's always come locally, but then you have to mobilize things politically to get to the point where that investment is made.
That's great. Okay, there's a question over here, I think. Oh, sorry, okay. Yes, question here.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Lesser. I'm a master's student with SEPA and the Earth Institute. So my question is, how are Columbia's global centers facilitating connections between regional and national policymakers?
Right, there we go. Who wants to start on that? Josh?
I can give one example from the Mumbai Global Center. The program that I described is a direct interface between policymakers at different levels, but another initiative that the Global Center has done is just this past summer convened a regional discussion on climate change and water in the Middle East, and brought together policymakers and scientists at multiple levels of government. And so the convening powers of the global centers is one way in which you can get that merger of local, national, regional, and technical expertise all in the same room to have a discussion and build a platform for work going forward.
Ruth, do you want to say anything about how things, okay. Okay, anybody else? So,
and I think that I mean, we've done that in Beijing. That convening capacity is where policymakers come together. It does come back to the point I made earlier, though, which is like that's a skill, and that is a capacity that needs to be built. And so in some cases we have it, but not totally yet. Like, at the Energy Center, we've built a capacity. We have a team of people, many of whom held senior positions in the US government. We know how to engage with the US government. I'm not gonna pretend I know how to engage with the government in Delhi. Like, that's not my skill set. So it does require building that capacity if we really want to define that as a metric of success for the university.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Reading between the lines of all of your rather impressive projects and activities and initiatives and so forth, you must, all of you at one time or another, kind of hit some kind of ethical choice. A right and wrong as against a kind of a true and false, or a useless and useful, but a kind of a right and a wrong choice. And when you hit that choice, do you wing it? What do you do? Do you convene a group to talk about how to think through this ethical issue on whether food or whether it's health or what have you? What goes on in your head, in your team's head, not just the individual, when you hit those situations?
All right, that's a proper exam question. What goes on in your head? Right. All right, Lisa, tell us about ethics, because you're quite...
Ethical. It's a great question. We have a lot of discussions within our center on the ethics of the projects that we're doing. I think it comes up a lot when we're working with the private sector and development, and some of the tensions and trade-offs that we've alluded to now. I wish I could say that we have a more formal process than having the absolute privilege to have elaborate conversations with really thoughtful, bright colleagues, but that is our process. So we have some kind of due diligence frameworks. We very frequently rely on really distinguished advisors in our advisory board, our colleagues at the Earth Institute to think through some of these dilemmas. But as Jason can surely say much more, I feel like our being in the policy world inherently involves a lot of trade-offs and conflicts. I will say that I don't feel like we struggle. Somehow I feel like our ethical North Star is always there. So it's not that we struggle with doing unethical things. I think the ethics is always there. What we seem to be navigating is the best choice of resources, partners, and trade-offs. I would say that's kind of my best answer to that question.
But I mean, given the scale of the climate crisis, ethics must be at the heart of all this issue about social justice and policy and law going forward and global governance. To what extent do you think actually we just haven't done enough work on this subject globally to actually get your head around it?
Well, can I maybe add one thing on that?
Sure.
Because it's something that Jason said that is a massive ethical problem for all of us, which is that we have to decarbonize. We have more proven reserves than we can safely burn. But as Jason alluded to, it's a lot of the developing countries that have not contributed to the situation that we're in that are discovering the world-class deposits that they want to develop because that is their basically only economic resource. So Guyana has a world-class deposit, West Africa, East Africa. So this is a global ethical challenge that I do not think that we are prepared to address globally. How should we allocate the remaining carbon budget? If we do it on the basis of economics only, first of all, most likely we're not going to allocate it and we're going to blow past our carbon budget. If we even had the wherewithal to come together and cooperate, which I worry we don't, and do it on the basis of cost, then that would mean that the lowest cost deposits are already in the developed countries that have contributed the most, that have the least need for these, or in the Gulf. Yeah. But how do we address the serious ethical challenge of addressing, that ethical dilemma? That I think is something we are trying to think through, but the world is woefully, I think, underprepared for that ethical challenge.
Yeah, I'll just give you one other quick example. Okay. I agree with all of that. And so when I was in the Obama White House, we developed something called the social cost of carbon. Some people may be familiar with for the purpose of regulatory rulemaking, cost-benefit analysis. How much is it worth to not put a ton of CO2 in the air? You're willing to pay a lot, but not an infinite amount. That had never really been done before. It's a host of issues and questions you need to ask in trying to assess that. And one is the discount rate you use. How do you value damages in the very distant future in today's dollars? We had a team of economists answering that. It's not it's not an economics question. That's a moral question. That's a philosophical question. And we didn't have really good guidance. There wasn't a literature in ethics or philosophy. There was a lot of economic journal articles to look at that would help us make that choice. I think that's a good example of something where collaborative joint research to really help think about these things is needed.
We're going to have to wrap this up quickly. Ruth.
Well, I'll just say that my ethical conversation with myself is about how do we spend our time? What research questions, or what do we do with this incredible opportunity we have being here at a university like Columbia, where we can define our own research questions? What are the ethically correct questions to be working on? And that's how I got to this issue of working on the food systems in India, because you see a very poor farmer struggling who will live and die by whether the monsoon arrives on time. And that's just an issue that, to me, we have to be working on. Much more relevant to me than working on some esoteric scientific question that might be published in some high-profile publication. So that's the way I think about my ethical conversation is, are we working on the right questions?
Right. Josh, do you want to come in very quickly?
Yeah, just one very quick word is that this question of ethics really permeates the entire research and policy flow. Beginning really, I think, at the composition of our research teams, gender, race, privileged background, who's the PI, who are the researchers, how do we work with the affiliates at partner institutions or in partner and host countries. These are questions that I think we really need to take incredibly, incredibly seriously. And particularly since we're discussing the global centers, we need to think about the positioning and the power dynamics vis-a-vis PIs who look like me, working with partners in countries that don't necessarily have that same demographic. And so I think it's just a point to say that we really need to take these things seriously.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we're going to make this very quick.
Sure. I'm very interested in the power of investment capital and what it can do to bring us closer to reach the SDGs. Your interaction with the investment community, what is it that's blocking them from moving capital faster? What can the academic community do to help that? And where do you think we really need regulation?
All right, Lisa.
Oh my goodness, it's such an important and such a big question. To try to keep it brief, I've come to the conclusion that by far the greatest player that we need to put pressure on is the public sector. I think, and we're fortunately already seeing some movement there. So there's the Network to Green the Financial System, coalition of central banks, of regulators. Their action to incorporate some of the climate risks into their financial policy and monetary policy, I think will have far more decisive impacts on what financial institutions do. Second group I think we need to put pressure on are the asset owners, because unfortunately what I've come to conclude is that the asset managers, which is a lot of the players we interact with, a lot in the investment community, are, at least in this country, especially constrained in what, or feel constrained in what they can do because they feel like they're managing on behalf of someone else. So I think the pressure is in those who have the assets, the pension funds, the university endowments, and other asset owners to think meaningfully about how they want to use their capital, both in terms of directing investments in places where we need investments, that's critical, investing in the new technologies for renewable energies, et cetera, but also recognizing that all investment has impact. So how do we ensure that the rest of our non-impact investing portfolio is aligned with our values?
I'm going to add one sentence because we're running out of time. My perspective is, you asked why private capital is not moving more quickly from traditional to alternative energy. They can't make as much money.
Right. That's a good, quick answer. One last question here, I think we're going to be. Okay, let's take both questions together.
Everyday consumers vote with their wallet all the time. And that drives a lot of what governments do, what corporations do. So I'm wondering, to what extent is it a viable approach to educate consumers in each different city? If you care about the environment, you buy this and you don't buy that. You support this project and you don't support that project. And is that a viable way of approaching the problems?
Right. So we need to be much more better networked and joined up across the piece in what you're saying, basically. There was another question, yeah.
Hi, Jason mentioned that in China, natural gas is embraced because it's so much cleaner than coal, obviously. But in this country, groups like 350.org have a saying, keep it in the ground, and that natural gas is a bridge fuel that no longer needs to be used. We can go straight to renewables as the costs have plummeted for solar and wind. And I'm just wondering, in countries like China and elsewhere, what do you think is the prospects for keeping it in the ground? I mean, for just bypassing natural gas even and going straight to renewables, to 100% clean energy?
Oh, wow, okay, great questions. Another quick question here.
Sure. So the empowerment of young people is going to be very important in this effort. And in fact, with regard to climate change and civic engagement in particular. So I'd love to hear your ideas on how we can be more intentional in engaging students in this great work and leveraging the footprint of the global centers, and particularly undergraduate students.
Okay, and then one last question over here.
Well, I heard the word popularizing, and I think Greta Thunberg did such a great job getting out the message about climate danger. And I think popularizing it and engaging the general public. Academia is wonderful, and I'm so proud of Columbia's dedication to worldwide and actually getting in, doing the nitty-gritty. I'm also very, very proud of Lamont Doherty, and it has perfected, I do believe, how many people know the word sequestration I thought I would hear that magic word here today, but I didn't hear it. And that means sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And this has to be perfected and perpetuated, popularized. And I don't like the word sucker. We've been suckers too long for the fossil fuel industry. And we need to make changes. And I'm suggesting a way to popularize it is instead of calling them suckers, we should be calling lollipops. And if you love your kids, build them lollipops.
That's a great idea. Okay, on that note, this is some quick responses, then we're going to have to wrap it up. So, God, we had such a range of things. Jason, do you want to come back on the issue of keeping carbon in the ground?
I think the prospects are low and understandably low, and partly because the scale of energy growth is so large and so rapid. They sort of need it all to get there. It's difficult to do only with renewable energy, but it's also solar and wind, even with the intermittency and the declining costs of utility scale storage and batteries, generates electricity. And electricity is 25% of global emissions. And so the example I gave about China was China replacing coal-fired boilers. So you don't, you don't replace that with solar and wind unless you first electrify heating throughout rural China. And that is not an easy thing to do. That's a pretty costly and difficult thing to do. The same with the most rapidly growing use of natural gas around the world is heavy industry. Making cement and steel and aluminum and other things. And that's also hard to do with renewables. And I think, and Faye will have thoughts about this, but I think in many of these parts of the world, it's clear that the primary driver of action is local air pollution more than climate change. And we can debate how much better, gas is than coal or oil with methane leakage and other things. It's much better from a local air pollution standpoint. So when you have difficulty breathing the air in capitals in South Asia, and there's a ready alternative in gas, along with growth in renewable energies, I think it's good. I think gas demand growth is going to be pretty strong there.
Any other quick responses? We're going to have to wrap this up, I'm afraid, even though, yeah.
I can maybe respond to the question about consumers and consumer activism. I think I think that consumers should be informed. I think one challenge that we have is that we don't have sufficient disclosures or information about some of the climate intensity or the carbon intensity of products that consumers are consuming. So I think that there are a few things we could do about that. I think we could advocate for greater disclosures on non-financial aspects of companies. It's a bit harder in this country, but Europe is far ahead, much farther ahead in terms of mandating certain types of non-financial disclosures of companies. And then I think researchers can help to shed light on the practices of especially consumer-facing brands and companies, and how consumer pressures, whether through the dollars they're spending or other means of kind of activism, could help to influence those companies. I'm not fully convinced that that's the most effective and direct way, but I think it is one avenue that should be part of the mix.
Okay. Can I just add one sentence on that, on the consumer, question? That all of that is great. Responsible consumer choices, eating less meat, flying less, buying from the right companies, that's all wonderful, but it is insufficient for the scale of the problem that we're facing. That individual choice is not going to turn us around with climate change. Really, the most important thing we can do is have the right leaders, bring the right leaders who will make the decisions.
Yeah. Okay, I need to close it down. Just everybody give them a big round of applause, and all the people asking questions.
Sitting, standing.
I need you to say some, So just before you go, before you all go, I just wanted to make just one quick announcement, and that is that this is all about the global centers, and the global centers have been amazingly important. And of course, Lee Bollinger, who sadly has left, it was his idea, and along with a number of other people, Ken Pruitt was involved as well, in actually getting these global centers going. But their success today has been largely due to the influence of Safwan Masri, and I just wanted to quickly introduce him. He's going to say a couple of words in closing. He's Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University and a Senior Research Scholar at Columbia's SIPA, a scholar on education and contemporary geopolitics and society in the Arab world. His work focuses on understanding the historic post-colonial dynamics among religion, education, society, and politics, pretty relevant to climate change. He is the author of Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, just recently published by Columbia University Press, which examines why Tunisia was the only country to emerge from the Arab Spring as a democracy. Very important. His writings on education and current affairs have been featured in the Financial Times, Huffington Post, The Hill, and Times Higher Education. He is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations, an honorary fellow of the Royal Policy Association, and a member of the International Advisory Council of the World Congress for Middle Eastern Studies. So please join me in welcoming Safwan Masri, who's going to wrap things up with a few comments.
Thank you, Alex. I'll be very, very brief. I know we've run out of time, and I'm very glad that you gave a shout out to Ken Pruitt. Ken, where are you? I saw you ask a question. It's great to have you here. Ken is my predecessor, so he was there on the ground floor when we started with the Global Centers initiative. So this capstone event really marks the 10-year anniversary of the Global Centers, and it is the 10th event in a year-long series that we call 10 by 10, 9 events, each curated by one of the 9 Global Centers, and then this as the capstone event. And we've had all kinds of diversity in terms of the events that we've curated. Brazil focused on the Rio Center on inequality. Democracy in the MENA region was something that the Tunis Center curated. The Nairobi Center brought to us the issue of peace and how African women leaders are building new peace movements. The Amman Center pushed the envelope by curating a presentation here on campus on queer Arab cinema. We started the series with the Paris Center curating an event that explored how women who have survived atrocities in the Democratic Republic of Congo have reclaimed their bodies and stories through dance, and how they are translating this work into government policy, public health, medicine, peacekeeping, art, political activism, and law. And so to cap this off with this incredible panel this evening is just phenomenal. So I want to thank you first and foremost, Alex, Ruth, Josh, Lisa, Jason, and Faye. With Ruth in particular, she's the chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee for Mumbai. So your involvement with the Global Center in Mumbai is incredibly important. The afternoon showed one of the challenges that we've adopted also as a network theme across the global centers, because there isn't a single global center that is not working on something, working with faculty on a dimension of climate change. So we've adopted it as a global theme. There's another global theme that I want to mention to you, and that is related to forced migration. And just a couple of things on that. Tomorrow we will announce the launch of a new scholarship program for displaced students. It's overseen by the Global Centers. The program will offer 30 fully funded scholarships annually across all 18 Columbia schools and affiliates for displaced students from anywhere in the world. This is the first ever Columbia-wide scholarship program, and it's the world's first initiative of this kind, as far as we know. Thank you. Thank you. Much of the credit goes to Professor Bruce Usher from the Business School, head of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise, and we've supported already a cohort of 7 displaced students living in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and in the US. Another initiative that we have adopted to support displaced people is a fellowship supported by the Menon Foundation that supports emerging displaced scholars working in the humanities. For scholars who have been forcibly uprooted from their home countries and academic institutions. The fellowship runs for 12 months, and it will support 25 scholars over 4 years at the Amman Center. We've launched also the Committee on Forced Migration with 40 faculty members from across the university to provide a convening platform and a channel for identifying areas of collaboration and an institutional space to advance discourse, both internal and public discourse. So forced migration is very much related to climate, and I think the two things intersect wonderfully in the life and the work of the global centers. This event, also the capstone event, marks the last bit of the program that we have held since yesterday evening with our advisory board members. We have around 40 advisory board members and spouses from all over the world. Every single global center is represented, has been represented here over the past 24 hours. I want to thank you for coming here. I want to thank you for taking advantage of connecting with the university, connecting with the network, getting to know one another from different global centers, and seeing the impact that the global centers are having beyond the center that you are directly involved in. I'll just close by saying that when we started off 10 years ago, we were not sure whether we would get here in 10 years. We weren't exactly sure what form we would be in, and we couldn't be more pleased with what we've accomplished because of the partnerships that exist with the faculty, through the work with the students. We heard today from two brilliant students, Shannon, you would have been very, very proud, and through the support of the advisory boards. And I think that today, especially with what the world is going through in terms of democracy under stress, access, connections, much more difficult, citizens rising around the world for greater income equality and rights, and around climate change, it is ever more important to be out there in the world and to be engaged the way that we are. So with you, we hope to accomplish a lot more and really create a model for how a university like Columbia engages with the world. So thank you very much, and we invite you to join us for a reception downstairs. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for joining us. Please exit to the rear left of the auditorium, then proceed to the elevators.